The world adored Diane Keaton for her charm, wit, and timeless grace. But behind the laughter and iconic roles, a heartbreaking truth was quietly unfolding. In her final days, the beloved star faced struggles few ever knew about. What really happened in those last moments? What secrets did she carry to the very end? As friends, fans, and Hollywood insiders come forward, the truth about Diane Keaton's final days is finally being revealed, and it changes everything. Morning was quiet in Brentwood, the kind of California stillness that feels almost sacred. Sunlight slipped through the curtains of Diane Keaton's home, painting soft gold across the room she called her quiet house. On the table beside her armchair sat a half-finished cup of tea, still warm, and her reading glasses resting on an open journal. She had been writing, as she often did, about love, life, and what it means to be at peace with both. When her daughter Dexter entered the room, she thought her mother was simply lost in thought, staring toward the window, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. But the silence that filled the air was different this time. It was final, heavy, yet strangely gentle. Dexter called out softly, "Mom," but there was no reply. For a long moment, she stood frozen, her mind refusing to accept what her heart already knew. Then she reached for her phone, her hands trembling, whispering through tears as she called her brother Duke. "She's gone." The words hung between them like a weight too heavy to carry. Within hours, the house that had always felt so full of warmth and laughter became unbearably still. Later that morning, the family released a short, simple statement. Diane Keaton passed peacefully at her home, surrounded by light, love, and the world she built with her own hands. It was exactly the kind of farewell Diane would have wanted. Quiet, sincere, free of spectacle. While the world began to mourn, Dexter and Duke sat in their mother's garden, the one she had planted and tended herself. The air smelled of lavender and sage, her favorite scents. They spoke softly about her rituals, her morning walks, her endless journals, her late-night tea. "She used to say solitude wasn't loneliness," Dexter whispered. "But now, it feels the same." By sunset, candles flickered across the garden, their glow reflecting off the ivy-covered walls of the house she loved. No crowds, no cameras. Just her children, a few close friends, and the quiet hum of nature. The world outside would soon explode with headlines and tributes. But here, in this stillness, her family chose peace. Diane had always believed that life should end as it began. In silence, in grace, in truth. And so, as the stars rose over Los Angeles, the woman who had filled the world with laughter and courage took her final bow, leaving behind not emptiness, but light. Diane Keaton's story didn't begin in fame or fortune. It began in a quiet Los Angeles home where emotions were tucked neatly behind smiles and dinner table prayers. Born on January 5, 1946, Diane grew up surrounded by sunshine, but her world often felt dim. Her father, Jack, was a gentle man who believed that order was love. Her mother, Dorothy, once crowned Mrs. Los Angeles, had dreamed of the stage but traded her spotlight for motherhood. Behind her smile, little Diane saw something fade, a light dimming slowly, day by day. The Hall household looked perfect from the outside. 4 children, polished manners, laughter reserved for guests. But beneath the surface lived silence, the kind that hums beneath polite words and clinks of silverware. "We didn't talk about feelings," Diane would say later. "We just lived inside them." That silence became her teacher. It taught her how to observe, how to listen, and how to find meaning in what people didn't say. More than that, it lit a spark of rebellion. She loved her mother deeply, but she promised herself one thing. She would not live unseen. As a child, Diane would stand in the kitchen doorway, watching her mother wash dishes with that perfect pageant smile, pretending she wasn't tired. To everyone else, Dorothy was the picture of grace, but to Diane, she was a warning, a life quietly disappearing beneath duty. One day, Diane decided she would not vanish that way. She wanted noise, she wanted color, she wanted to exist out loud. In high school, she was awkward, strange, and always a little too much. Teachers said she had potential but lacked discipline. Classmates didn't understand her odd humor or her love for vintage clothes and old movies. But inside her, a quiet fire was building. When she stepped onto the stage for the first time, playing Blanche Dubois in a school production, something inside her cracked open. "That was the first time I felt seen," she later said. "It wasn't acting, it was survival." At 20, she packed her dreams into a single suitcase and left Los Angeles for New York City. She dropped her last name, Hall, and took her mother's maiden name, Keaton, part tribute, part rebellion. The city welcomed her with cold wind and rejection. Her apartment was tiny, the wallpaper peeling, the radiator barely working. Some nights she fell asleep in her coat, her breath fogging against the window. She wrote letters to her mother but rarely sent them. She didn't want pity. She wanted proof that she could make it on her own. The city was merciless. She waited in endless lines for auditions that lasted minutes. Too tall, too strange, not the type. The words echoed again and again. By day she waited tables. By night, she sang in smoky bars for a few dollars and the hope that someone would notice. Her dinners were tea and half a slice of bread. But she refused to quit. "Fear became my engine," she said later. "It kept me moving." One freezing night, after yet another rejection, she walked for hours through the city just to stay warm. Snowflakes clung to her hair, and tears froze before they could fall. Yet somewhere deep inside, she whispered to herself, "Not yet." That tiny voice kept her alive through hunger, loneliness, and self-doubt. Every closed door became another reason to push harder. In 1968, everything changed. A Broadway revival of Hair was looking for someone raw, real, and unpolished. Diane showed up barefoot, trembling, but determined. She didn't perform to impress, she performed like it was her last chance to breathe. When she finished, the room fell silent. The director finally said, "Don't change a thing." That night, under the stage lights, the silence she'd carried her whole life broke open. For the first time, she felt like she belonged. From there, her rise wasn't sudden, but steady. The same girl who once sang for spare change was now catching the attention of casting directors. Yet she never forgot the cold nights, the hunger or the loneliness. They became her fuel. Her pain was no longer a burden. It was her material. She had learned how to turn silence into art, fear into performance, and heartbreak into truth. By the early 1970s, she landed a role that would change her life forever. The Godfather. Standing in front of Al Pacino, she brought to the screen that same trembling honesty that had carried her through every rejection. People said her performance felt too real, but that was exactly the point. Diane didn't act, she revealed. Her childhood silence had taught her something powerful. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. And that's what made her different. Hollywood was full of stars trying to dazzle, but Diane shone because she didn't pretend to be perfect. She was messy, emotional, funny, awkward, and people loved her for it. Behind every role, behind every smile, was the little girl who once stood in a quiet kitchen watching her mother's dreams fade. But instead of letting that silence define her, she turned it into something beautiful. Diane Keaton didn't just become a star. She became a voice for anyone who had ever felt invisible. Her journey from silence to stardom wasn't just about talent. It was about endurance, grace, and the courage to keep showing up even when the world said no. She built her life the same way she built her art, brick by brick, heartbreak by heartbreak, until the quiet girl from Los Angeles became the woman who taught generations that being real was its own kind of perfection. Fame came to Diane Keaton like a storm. Bright, loud, and impossible to escape. One moment she was a young actress trying to make rent in a drafty New York apartment, and the next she was standing under the blinding lights of Hollywood, her name echoing through theaters across the world. The Godfather changed everything. Her role as Kay Adams wasn't just acting, it was transformation. She carried into that performance every quiet fear, every lonely night, every ounce of hunger she had ever known. Audiences saw something different in her, something raw, imperfect, and heartbreakingly real. And suddenly, Diane Keaton wasn't just another actress. She was the new voice of truth in a town built on illusions. But with fame came pressure, the kind that seeps into every corner of your life. After The Godfather came Annie Hall, and with it, immortality. The film wasn't just a success. It became a cultural shift. Her awkward laughter, her offbeat fashion, her fearless honesty, it all became iconic. People copied her style, quoted her lines, tried to imitate her energy. But Diane wasn't trying to be a symbol, she was simply being herself. What the world didn't see was that behind her calm humor and bright smile was a woman quietly terrified of being trapped by her own image. She once said, "The higher you climb, the thinner the air gets," and that's exactly what fame felt like, beautiful but suffocating. Every new role came with the same unspoken question: can you ever be that good again? The more the world praised her, the harder she pushed herself. She rehearsed until her voice gave out, rewrote lines in dressing rooms, and stayed up until dawn chasing a kind of perfection that didn't exist. She worked not out of vanity, but out of fear of losing what she had built, fear of fading into silence again. And while the world saw confidence, inside she was crumbling under expectations that no one else could see. She was the woman who made millions laugh, yet cried quietly in her car after long days on set. She was adored by audiences, but haunted by loneliness. "I used to think success would make me whole," she admitted years later. "But maybe it just gave me permission to be broken in public." It was during this storm of success that love found her, or maybe she found love in the middle of the chaos. On the set of The Godfather, she met Al Pacino. He was magnetic, mysterious, and just as lost in his own genius as she was in her vulnerability. Together, they created something rare, a love that wasn't about glamour, but recognition. They saw in each other a mirror, a shared ache for something real in a world made of performance. Their connection was quiet but deep. Between takes, they would talk for hours about nothing and everything: books, childhood, fear, the absurdity of fame. He made her laugh like no one else could. She made him feel understood. "I was crazy about him from the start," Diane once said. But their love wasn't simple. It was the kind of love that burned slowly, leaving both people scorched. For years, their relationship was a dance, close, then distant, then close again. Diane believed that someday when the noise of Hollywood quieted, they'd finally build a life together. She imagined mornings reading the paper, children with his dark eyes and her laugh, peace after all the chaos. But Al was a man afraid of being tied down. Fame had made him restless, always running from the very thing that could have saved him. In 1990, during the filming of The Godfather Part 3 in Rome, Diane thought the time had finally come. They were older, wiser, maybe ready to begin. One night, under the warm Roman light, she asked him softly, "Marriage or goodbye?" It wasn't an ultimatum, it was surrender. But Al looked at her with that same haunted silence she had come to know too well. He didn't say no, he didn't say anything, and that was the answer. "He didn't have to speak," she said later. The silence said it for him. She packed her things that night, folding her dreams between clothes that smelled of wine and heartbreak. She left before dawn, the city still asleep, her plane lifting off as the sun rose over Rome, leaving behind the man who would always be both her greatest love and deepest wound. That silence followed her home, wrapping around her like a shadow. She didn't cry in public. She never did. But something inside her had broken for good. And as if fate wanted to test her strength, life struck again. Only weeks later, her father, Jack, was diagnosed with a brain tumor. The man who had been her quiet anchor was fading fast. She sat beside him in the hospital, holding his hand, whispering, "Don't go yet, Dad. I'm not ready." But death doesn't wait. Losing him, she said later, felt like losing the last light left on in the house. That year nearly destroyed her. 2 heartbreaks, one of love, one of loss, arrived hand in hand. She stopped answering calls. She barely ate. Friends said she looked hollow, like a woman trying to live with a missing piece. "I broke then," she said quietly. Not loudly, just quietly broke. But even in the ruins, Diane did what she had always done. She rebuilt. She went back to work, not to escape, but to survive. Acting became her therapy, her confession, her prayer. Every line she spoke carried traces of her truth. The ache of loving someone who couldn't love her back. The pain of saying goodbye to a father who never stopped believing in her. Her performances deepened. They weren't just roles anymore. They were pieces of her soul stitched together for the world to see. In the years that followed, Diane stopped chasing love the way she once had. She never married. She stopped trying to fill the silence with someone else's voice. Instead, she learned to live with it, to let it become her companion rather than her curse. She poured her heart into art, architecture, and eventually, motherhood. In her 50s, she adopted 2 children, Dexter and Duke, and found in them the love that never left. "They saved me," she said simply. The woman who once built herself out of fear finally learned to rest in peace. Not the kind that ends, but the kind that heals. She stopped hiding behind characters and started living as herself. Flawed, funny, fiercely real. Fame had given her a platform, love had given her lessons, and loss had given her wisdom. By the time the applause began to fade, Diane Keaton no longer needed it. She had already found what truly mattered: grace in solitude, strength in softness, and love that didn't need to be returned to be real. And though her story was marked by heartbreak, it was never tragic. It was proof that even the deepest fractures can glow when lit by fire. The kind of fire that made her who she was: bright, defiant, and beautifully unbroken. When the applause faded and the lights dimmed, what remained of Diane Keaton was not fame, not trophies, not headlines, but the quiet strength of a woman who learned to live on her own terms. In the end, her legacy was not about glamour or glory. It was about resilience, love, and the courage to keep creating even when no one was watching. Acting Recession, a Disney movie. The world saw her as a legend, but to those who knew her, she was something far more human. A woman who turned her pain into art and her solitude into peace. After decades of fame, Diane had built a world that reflected her spirit. Her Brentwood home wasn't a mansion built for show. It was a sanctuary. Sunlight spilling through old windows, books stacked in corners, and walls lined with photographs she had taken herself. She called it the Quiet House, and it truly was. The floors creaked, the garden overflowed with lavender and sage, and every inch of it carried her touch. Friends said she designed it the way she lived, with imperfection, honesty, and warmth. "It's not about perfection," she once said. "It's about meaning." Her mornings began with tea, her dog padding beside her as she walked barefoot through the garden. She talked to her plants like old friends, whispering to them as if they could keep her secrets. Fame had once chased her everywhere, but in her later years, she didn't chase it back. She didn't need red carpets or interviews to feel alive anymore. She had learned that peace wasn't found in applause. It was found in stillness. Diane's later life was filled with quiet purpose. She poured herself into architecture, photography, and preservation. She loved old buildings, especially the forgotten ones, cracked, faded, and waiting to be saved. "I love restoring what time tried to erase," she once said. "It's like giving something a second chance, the same way I had to give myself one." Her homes became works of art. She rescued historic properties across Los Angeles, restoring them not for profit, but for beauty, for memory. Each one became a reflection of her philosophy, that broken things can still be beautiful. She also kept giving quietly, away from the spotlight. Millions went to charities she never announced: women's shelters, mental health programs, art education. She believed kindness didn't need cameras. She used to say, "You don't have to make noise to make a difference." And she proved it. People who worked with her described her as funny, generous, and fiercely loyal. If she loved you, she didn't say it with words. She showed it with care, with time, with presence. But her greatest love in those years was her children. Dexter and Duke were her anchors, her greatest creation. She had adopted them when she was in her 50s, believing she was done with love. But they changed everything. They brought laughter back into her home, music, chaos, and color. She cooked, told stories, built forts in the living room, and spent evenings watching old movies with them. "They saved me," she would say. "I thought I was finished with life. Then they showed me I was just beginning." Through them, she found the kind of love that doesn't vanish. Her legacy wasn't loud. It was felt in the people she inspired. The young actresses who saw her as proof that you didn't need to be perfect to matter. She showed that beauty wasn't about youth, that strength didn't have to mean hardness. Emma Stone once said, "Diane made it okay for women to be strange, brave, and real." That was her quiet revolution. In an industry obsessed with appearance, she stayed herself. Quirky hats, turtlenecks, awkward laughter, and all. She never tried to blend in, and because of that, she stood out forever. Even her approach to aging was defiant in its simplicity. She didn't hide from time. She welcomed it. Her gray hair, her lines, her honesty. All of it became part of her beauty. "Why pretend to be younger?" she once laughed. "Every wrinkle is a story I earned." In a world terrified of fading, Diane shone brighter by being real. That was her gift. She made authenticity look effortless. As fading gets hard, gets safer, she made authenticity look effortless. When she finally stepped back from acting, it wasn't an announcement. There was no farewell tour, no dramatic exit. She simply worked a little less and lived a little more. Her days slowed into rhythm: breakfast in the garden, photography in the afternoon, books at night. Sometimes she sat at her old piano, not to play for anyone, but just to feel the music hum through her fingers. Friends said her laughter softened with time, like her voice, quieter but just as full of light. She often said she didn't believe in endings, only transitions. The work ends, she once said, but the love keeps moving. And that was true even after her passing. Her children decided to preserve her home exactly as she left it. Her glasses still rest on her writing desk. Her journals are filled with sketches, reflections, and quiet wisdom. On one page she wrote, "I used to fear being alone. Now I see it's just another word for being with yourself." When she died, the world mourned loudly. Tributes from every corner, reels of her greatest scenes, interviews replayed across every network. But the real legacy wasn't in the noise. It was in the silence afterward. In the way people spoke her name softly, as if remembering someone who had changed them without even knowing it. Fans left flowers at her Brentwood gate, white turtlenecks folded neatly beside them, her signature symbol of defiant simplicity. One sign read, "You made us brave enough to be ourselves." That's what Diane Keaton left behind: permission. Permission to be awkward, permission to be afraid, permission to keep loving even when it hurts. Her fortune was estimated in the hundreds of millions, but her wealth was something else entirely. It was in her art, her restored homes, her children, her laughter echoing in old films. It was in every woman who decided to wear what she wanted, speak her truth, and stand alone without apology. She had once said, "People think success makes you safe, but it doesn't. Love does." In the years since her passing, her garden has continued to bloom. The lavender she planted still leans toward the morning light. Her son and daughter visit often, sitting under the trees she tended, sipping tea from her old cups. "She's still here," Dexter once said. "You can feel her in the light," and maybe that's the point. Diane Keaton's life was never about noise or spectacle. It was about presence, about being fully alive in every quiet, imperfect moment. When the applause ended, what remained wasn't emptiness. It was peace. A peace she had built brick by brick, heartbreak by heartbreak, until it became a home not just for her, but for everyone who ever needed to believe that gentleness could be powerful too. In the end, her legacy wasn't just a career. It was a lesson. That it's okay to break and rebuild. That solitude isn't loneliness. That truth outlasts fame. And that even after the lights go out, a soul like hers keeps shining. Quietly, endlessly, in the hearts she left behind.